Thank you so much. My name is Lenora Marshall. I am the Vice President of the Elaine Legacy Center. Miss Faye Duncan Daniels, will you stand? Is the president in the back, is the president of the Elaine Legacy Center. I want to say to the Floridians, and if there be other impressive people in the group today, I want to say welcome to you. There are so many ways to say welcome. And the most universal way to say welcome is to smile. Look at someone next to you and just smile. Thank you, thank you. So many ways to say welcome, such as, we are very happy to see you. The Elaine Legacy Center is so glad that you came to be with us today, and that's why we're glad to be here. We are extremely excited that you're here. It is such a pleasure for you to be with us. We are so fortunate that you could come here and hear our story. We treasure your presence. What a treat to have your support. So I would say welcome, voicing the sentiments of the Elaine Legacy Center. Welcome to Elaine, a place I hope by now that you feel at home. We look forward to your visit every year. It is so much help to have so many recording our oral stories. Now, Dr. Paul Ortiz, we especially welcome you because you skipped us last year. But you have been a scholar behind our work all year long. Help me to applaud that concept, you all. Thank you, Dr. Paul Ortiz. This year, we start off our time together thinking about the importance of your book, The Latinx and African American History of the United States, and how Elaine fits into all of this. Then Jennifer Hancock, raise your hand, Jennifer. She's our researcher, documenting our oral histories, will offer us just a few of her findings. You are welcome beyond the shadow of a doubt. Thank you.
I'm used to being the one who points the microphone at other people, so turnabout is fair play, as the elders said. But just on behalf of the University of Florida and the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program, I'm just so honored to be here. We traveled from Gainesville. We left Monday morning at 7 a.m., and we began our oral history experience interviewing and talking with children of the African American elders that I interviewed as a grad student at Duke University in the early and mid 1990s. Now, when I say the children, I mean children who are actually now older than I am. But my first interview experiences in the South were with Black freedom fighters from Leon County, Gadsden County, and then up into Arkansas when I did field work there as a grad student. Ms. Marshall, I never got down to Phillips County because we had so many interviews in and around the Fargo Agricultural School, what had been an all-black school founded by a student of Booker T. Washington's. And every summer they had a reunion where hundreds of alumni would come. But also Fargo became, for a while, at least the time that we were there, kind of the heart of an early reparations struggle. And an early struggle to try to figure out why counties like Phillips and Columbia and other counties had went from 40% black land ownership to 2% black land ownership. And as a labor historian, and I'm gonna get carried away, I'm supposed to do some more ceremonial things, but I'm kind of thinking out loud here. If you look at these signs, and I want us to take a minute to just kind of turn around and look at a couple signs. One is descendants of the Elaine 1919 massacre say, free Mumia now. And that is such an important struggle. And it makes sense. I give hundreds of lectures per year by now. This is the only place I have been in, and this year I've given lectures in the Bronx, in Queens, in the East Bay, East Los Angeles, and I've never been in a room, Dr. Olson, where I'm looking at the wonderful sign that says free Mumia now. Because unfortunately, a lot of my academic colleagues would be terrified. They'd say, well, Paul, we support Brother Mumia, but on the sly, secretly, because we don't want our dean or the president of the university to find out that we support Mumia. But look at that sign right there. Descendants of the Elaine 1919 massacre say free Mumia now. And then you go from that sign to Elaine, motherland of the civil rights movement. And to echo what Ms. Marshall said, that's where my book in African American and Latinx history of the United States, what I was trying to get at was these intergenerational struggles. Like I was born in 1964, and when I went into the military, U.S. Special Forces, and I came back in the late 80s to the U.S., to home, and I use home in quotes, air quotes. I was schooled in the United Farm Workers struggle, Cesar Chavez, Los Huerta. But even generations before that had fought and died, black and brown, Asian people, poor white people, to build a farm worker movement in this country. And every time they tried to build a farm worker movement, including the Southern Tenant Farmers Union in Arkansas, including the Alabama Sharecroppers Union in the Black Belt of Alabama, where we're actually finishing our trip in Macon County this year. Every time they try to do that, the people who ran the society, the governors, the mayors, the chambers of commerce people, would shoot those organizers down. They would brutalize them. They would torture them. They would lynch them. And one of the many projects that we share with you at the Elaine Legacy Center is working with the wonderful Equal Justice Initiative and Brian Stevenson's staff, and we'll be there towards the end of our trip. We're actually going to spend a day in Montgomery. But EJI is doing that work, and they're just kind of an umbrella organization. So in my county, Alachua County, where UF is, we have a remembrance committee. And we've been working hard to create markers and monuments in honor of the thousands of African Americans who were lynched and massacred between Reconstruction and the 1950s. And this is just one slice of US history. We could go a lot earlier, we could go a lot later. But the importance of Reconstruction to this whole story is, again, like 1919, and I'll get to 1919 in a minute, but Reconstruction was another period of tremendous promise in the society. Think about it. 250,000 African Americans had served in the Union Navy and in the United States Army. We have been interviewing, by the way, descendants of some of those Union Army sailors and veterans. One of the projects that we're working on in the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program, we've just interviewed a descendant of Robert Smalls, who was an Underground Railroad activist who escaped from slavery, who served in the Union Navy, and actually took command of a Union vessel when the Anglo captain, Anglo, by the way, is a term that we use for white people where I grew up, where the Anglo captain lost his nerve, and it was up to this ex-black slave to take command of this ship and win this naval battle. But those are the types of people that we're interviewing now. People who we're interviewing, descendant of a man who won the Medal of Honor at the assault on Fort Wagner. Some of you have seen that movie Glory with Denzel Washington, right? We're actually interviewing pretty soon a descendant of the man who scaled Fort Wagner in the face of cannon fire. Like, I was in combat in Central America, but I can never imagine having to charge against a cannon. Can you imagine that? So hundreds of thousands of African Americans, women and men, served with the United States military to win that war, win the Civil War. They served in combat, but equally importantly, they did things like they carried ammunition, they built trenches, they built railroads, they nursed the wounded. Those are all equally important to what happens on a battlefield, because you got to keep the supply lines working. You got to keep the material going to the troops. If you don't have that, you will lose. And it was African Americans who performed all those labors. So in 1865, it just made sense that you were going to, quote unquote, give the hundreds of thousands of people who fought to keep this country united, because make no mistake about it, if black people had not done that labor during the Civil War, we wouldn't be here today. The US would be 2 countries, or maybe 3, because that's what people were talking about back then. Abraham Lincoln, when he ran for office in 1864 for re-election, he was on the verge of losing the election, because the man he ran against was the former commander of the Union Army, General McClellan. They called him Mac. He was a widely loved character. And General Mac said, well, if I win this election, the North is tired of the Civil War. We don't really care about slavery. If we win, we're just going to let the South go. And they can have slavery and we'll be free. Free in quotes, right? And a number of reporters and advisors went to Abraham Lincoln and they begged him, President Lincoln, why don't you just let the South go? It's the only way you're going to win the election of 1864. And we have his words. He said, you must think I'm an ass. He said, the only thing keeping this entire nation together is the black man. He used a gendered term, common in the 1860s. Take the Negro soldier from our ranks, and the whole thing falls apart. The whole thing falls apart. And so those families, those black families at the end of the war just assumed that they would get land for their toils, for their sacrifices. And think about this. The U.S. had already given away tens of millions of acres to railroads, land trusts, landlords, corporations, harbor companies, I mean, tens of millions of acres. Like I tell my students, one man used to own the entire state of New Hampshire. That's the way we did land in this country. That's why my students asked me, Dr. Olson, on the way down, where are the farmers? I'm like, these farmers here, they're in Europe. They're in Paris, they're in Brussels, they're living the high life, or New York. They're not on the land. Who did the labor on the land? Mexicans, black people, Chinese workers, poor white people did the labor. So at the end of the Civil War, it was just assumed that if you can give 10 million acres to Commodore Cornelius Vanderbilt, how many of you have heard that name, Vanderbilt? You should. There's a university. It's a pretty good university, I've heard. That man got a 10 million acre grant of land for doing how much work? Nada, zero, zilch. So you can imagine if you're a Union Army veteran or an African-American woman who's lost everything at the end of the war, and you're thinking, well, if y'all can give 10 million acres to one rich white Anglo man, surely you can give 40 acres to my family. Didn't happen, or it happened for a little while on the Sea Islands, we know, on the Georgia coast, and then it was revoked. And this is a struggle that black people faced as a landless tenantry at the end of the Civil War. And think of all the struggles that black farmers had between the end of Reconstruction and 1919, not getting an ounce of land for the United States government, but watching the big farmers get everything. The Homestead Act, 160 acres, a fraud. Most of that land did not go to small landowners like your U.S. history textbooks have told you. Everything you read about the U.S. history textbooks about the Homestead Act, or about that act in 1861, a lot of it's a lie. When they say that farmers got 160 acres, most of that land went to speculators, and they would claim that they had settled a settler on the land, and they would take that land from the government, and they would bundle it and turn around, and suddenly 160 acres was like, 300,000 acres, and they would sell that to a railroad company. So that's how it usually worked. Big surprise. If you're in Florida, you're not going to be surprised at that story. But despite all those struggles, and I talk about this in African American Latinx history, and I talk about this in Emancipation Betrayed, African Americans in this county, by 1919, between 35 to 45% of black farmers own land. They own farms. Now, they weren't plantations, they weren't great haciendas, but they were farms. 10, 20, 40, 80 acres, sometimes more. And they had fought and toiled for generations for those farms. Black people had made political advancements that stunned the whole nation. They had organized with whites and Hispanics the NAACP in 1909. And the first 3 campaigns of the NAACP all had something to do with the struggle on the land. The first 3 campaigns that the NAACP waged was, number 1, the campaign against debt peonage. Black and brown and Asian and poor white farmers who had been caught in peonage, literally modern day slavery. That was the NAACP's banner campaign. Campaign number 2 was to equalize educational opportunities, equal pay for black teachers, equal educational opportunities for black students. Struggle number 3, and these all work together, you can't take one, they all work together, was the anti-lynching struggle. Many of the people who were lynched were people like Silas Hoskins, here in Elaine, Richard Wright's uncle, assassinated because he was a successful black business owner. And Richard Wright, and I remember, Dr. Olson, the first thing when we came into 1919, or when when our students first came here in 2019, and I just want to say this is really you know, this is the greatest academic honor of my life to be able to speak here in Elaine. I never dreamed, I mean, I read about the Elaine massacre for years. The idea that I would be in Phillips County talking about it and talking to descendants and talking to people who care about it, and most importantly, talking to people who can create signs like this and connect the struggle of 1919 to now, to me is so inspiring and astonishing. I have to turn in my professorial cynical card for at least a week. Like, I've lost my right to be cynical for at least a week, okay? To just be here and to be with people who understand and are trying to learn the history. Don't know the whole story. I don't know the whole story. Ms. Marshall doesn't know the whole story. None of us do, but together, organizing. That's what I want to talk about. The second half of my talk is organizing. But again, going back to 1919, African Americans were making astonishing political and economic and social gains in Arkansas, in Florida, in Chicago, in East St. Louis, in Longview, Texas. And guess what happens in the summer of 1919? Red Summer. You've read about it in your history books. James Weldon Johnson pens the term. Red Summer was not a bunch of white mobs. Whenever you see that term mobs in history textbooks, I give you the license to cross it out. A mob does not exist. What happened in Elaine was an organized massacre of black landowners, black union members, and black citizens writ large. It wasn't carried out by a mob. Mobs can't kill hundreds of people. Mobs are disorganized. And so when I started studying things like the Elaine Massacre or the Tulsa Massacre or the Rosewood Massacre or the Longview Massacre, I realized, wow, historians have got this all wrong. These attacks, these are military campaigns. These are supply and resupply campaigns, because you can't go through a community for more than like an hour without getting more ammunition. Where do you get the ammunition from? How do you know where to attack? You have intelligence, you have supply operations. So these massacres that took place in 1919, and I talk about this in African American Latinx history, between 1917 and 1923, hundreds of anti-black massacres were carried out by powerful white people who manipulated poorer white people usually to actually pull the triggers, to lynch people, to take land away from black landowners. Rosewood, the entire town was wiped out. The Ocoee Massacre, 1920, the year after the Elaine Massacre, the entire 2 black settlements were wiped out. All the black people were driven from the land, and the term they used back then were generous white real estate agents agreed to purchase the land from the fleeing black or the fleeing Negro residents. Check that out, generous. You can bet they didn't pay market value for that land. And so the Elaine Massacre is part of a national, I call it racial capitalism campaign to take resources away from black communities. And the state had to be involved in it in every single case. Another term I want you to wipe out of your intellectual toolkit is vigilante violence. There's no such thing as extra legal violence. That's a concept that bad history and bad scholarship has created, because you can't carry out a wide-scale mass murder without the complicity and the collusion of the courts, of law enforcement, of elected officials. And here, it was just a little more open than most other cases. A lynching is not an act of extra-legal violence, because a lynching took the collusion of the sheriff, of the local magistrate, or the police. And the reason I realize I'm kind of, I hate to use the phrase, flogging a dead horse, is to get us to understand the role that this state, not just Arkansas, but the U.S. has played in oppressing black people. And this is one of the reasons why reparations is not just needed, but it's just the right thing to do. But it can only be the right thing to do if you understand the origins behind the repression and how things like the Elaine Massacre were carried out. Yeah. So I'll wrap up here by talking about the movement part of this equation, because the movement part of it is, I think, even, understanding the roots of our oppression is really critical, but understanding how we have organized to overcome oppression is the thing we need to talk about now, okay? So again, the signs. Think about the connections that you have made here with Julia Wright, okay? And Richard Wright. And now I tell my students, you gotta read Black Boy, you gotta read Native Son, but you also should read Richard Wright went to Jakarta, Indonesia in 1955 to do what? To report on the Third World Gathering. And it was going to be a gathering of so-called Third World nations. And by the way, they use the term Third World instrumentally. Our people did, our ancestors in struggle. What they meant by that was the First World was the US and its satellites like the British Empire. The Second World was like the Soviet Union and a lot of the Eastern European nations. But the Third World was like us folks, the people who Malcolm X met with when he went to Africa and when he talked to Latin American leaders. People in what I call in the book, the Global South, Africa, Asia, Malaysia, Indonesia. Indonesia was such a critical centerpiece here. The Third World was going to be the new vision, the new way of doing things, anti-imperialist. Like the US, and again, you look at these agricultural fields here, and the US stays rich by oppressing other nations, by intervening. Check out that term again, intervention. What a term to paper over just like invading and taking people's stuff away from them. If I went and I robbed your house and stole everything you owned, and I called it an intervention, what would you think of me? And yet, the US does that all the time. So the Third World was a dream to do things differently. Maybe we could actually make a living by not stealing from other people, right? Richard Wright went there in 1955, and he wrote about it. And we want to connect him in Elaine in 1916 and what he saw as a boy with his membership for a while in the Communist Party. He left the Communist Party, he was disaffected by it. But then he ends up in Jakarta in 1955. So there's a connection between Elaine and Indonesia. And the connection is trying to imagine how we get free now. And Richard Wright felt that 1955 was going to be a turning point. Now, unfortunately, it wasn't in certain ways, but it also was part of the Civil Rights Movement and the Third World Liberation Movement. And as I kind of wrap up here and think about the present, what you're doing here in the Elaine Legacy Center is you're resisting current oppression and current injustices, and you're connecting them to historical injustices, but historical resistance. You allow us, you brought back the story of this nation's greatest journalist, whose name was Ida B. Wells Barnett, who came here in the wake of the Elaine Massacre and had the intelligence, she was our greatest journalist, by the way, had the intelligence to interview and talk to the people who had been brutalized in the Elaine Massacre. The state termed them as the perpetrators. But Ida B. Wells Barnett was one of the first people to understand these people were the victims. But by giving them voice and illuminating their voice, she turned the tables on the state. And suddenly the people who had been beaten and tortured and shamed into silence had a national platform. And if you haven't read that, the booklet that Ida B. Wells Barnett created after interviewing and doing research with Elaine survivors, you've got to read it. It's astonishing. So oral history plays such a huge role. We keep the struggle alive. 3 years ago, and I think it was the first year that we came here, that you have oral history, I've taken part in hundreds of discussions about reparations in San Francisco. I've been with Angela Davis. I've been with Cedric Robinson. One of my mentors is a great economist, Sandy Darity, who just finished a brilliant book on reparations. But I've never been in a conversation about reparations that was so intense and intelligent and deep thinking as the one that we had here in 2019. It was the best conversation by far.
Wow.
Better than San Francisco, but New York, way better. And I think the reason it is because, again, you have found a way here to connect the past with the present, with the future. And as I wrap up here, and you're like, oh, I hope he's wrapping up. So I am wrapping up. We've got to stay organized. We've got to stay linked to each other. We're from very different parts. I mean, even my students are from very different parts of, don't mix up South Florida with North Florida, right? At UF campus. I mean, we all have strong regional identities, right? We have different sexual identities, different class identities, different race identities. But don't let the state, don't let capitalism divide us, because that's what they want to do. They want us, and now I'm going to sound like an old curmudgeon. They want us to be on social media and just complain. Complain, complain, complain. Social media, what my elders said was, that and $1.50 will get you a ticket on the New York subway. Big deal. It's more than that now, right? But when we're organized, I mean, that's why I'm wearing my union t-shirt. We're giving Governor Ron DeSantis a good run for his money, by the way. Right? A lot of people outside the state don't know this. We have a injunction against the Stop Woke Act. We stopped Governor DeSantis. We got a call one day in the University of Florida. Governor DeSantis doesn't want gender studies anymore. We're going to have to shut down women's studies at the University of Florida. Someone called the union office. I was president for 3 years. I just stepped down. I said, you can't shut down women's studies department at UF. We have a collective bargaining agreement. You can't change the terms and conditions of our work without coming to us. And we're not going to agree to that. And we stopped that, man. We all said, we're like, it's not a dictatorship yet, Ms. Marshall. We're moving that direction, but it's not a dictatorship yet. So again, a united union of people from different identities, different parts of the country, stop DeSantis from shutting down women's studies and black studies. But we don't have enough people in the movement yet. We don't have enough people in the movement. We need to fill all the rooms, right? Some of my colleagues are like, well, Paul, I'd like to join the faculty union, but my dean doesn't like unions. Or my president doesn't like, and these are people with PhDs, so it's not education, right? They're like, oh, I'm afraid, Paul. What if President Sass finds out? Like, that's the least of your worries. Getting organized is so critical. That's why when I look at that sign, Elaine, Motherland of the Civil Rights Movement, the Arkansas freedom struggle in 1919 in the Southern Tenant Farmers Union, when the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee came here, who do you think they worked with in the 60s? They worked with the descendants of the Elaine massacre, who brought them in, who adopted these young civil rights idealistic people from the Ivy League. But it was those people who Ida B. Wells Barnett had talked to, and that's what I get to, the intergenerational part of it. It can't just be like the old timers and the young people. It's got to be everyone working together. And we have a long struggle ahead of us, but because of the work that you've done here, I'm just so inspired, and I think we can win. And I know that we're going to win. So thank you for your patience, and I'll turn the microphone over. to Jennifer Hadlock, who's going to talk to us about her research. She has some maps and things, and I love maps, by the way, Jennifer. I mean, my students are like, well, what about this? I'm like, you got to learn maps. Don't forget maps.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much, Dr. Ortiz. That was great. My name is Jennifer Hadlock, like padlock, but with an H. I have been here for about a year. I live in New York City, and I'm on the board of directors of a group called the Fund for Reparations Now, which is trying to organize white people to give money to start implementing the National African American Reparations Commission 10-point plan to start doing reparations for Black people already, not having to wait for HR 40 and the government to pass. That needs to happen too, and we've been pushing for that. But in the meantime, we're trying to start doing reparations. And Elaine Legacy Center was one of the first places that we've worked with through Ivor Carruthers, who was at that Reparations Commission meeting here. And hopefully soon, this building will become the museum in Elaine to tell the true story of what has happened here and the ongoing massacre that continues to this day. And I came down here because I was part of the fund, and I happen to be an attorney. I don't practice law in the traditional sense. Shh, don't tell them that. I'm an organizer, and I've been doing community organizing for almost 30 years. But I do have my law degree and a license, and so they said they needed a white person from the north to come and go into the courthouse downtown. I don't know if you've been downtown yet, probably not in Helena. Well, you will go there because anyway, the courthouse had a very racist woman as a clerk, and so no one had ever been able to go into the courthouse, into the room where all the property records were. And the rumor was that they had all been destroyed, and that they were gone and been lost. And even once I came last July, the judge, who's supposedly our friend, he said, oh no, they've been moved to a different building, there's nothing back there. Lies. There is so much documentation now that I've been back there. It is a treasure trove. Some people in this room have been with me and seen the amazing amount of documentation that's back there, going back to 1820, the property deeds. There's pages that have been torn or cut or crossed out. There's so much information there. It's overwhelming. But there is now a woman who is Black, who's a descendant, who's from here, who's very happy for me to be back there digging into the records. And so that has been wonderful. But I've also found lots of other information, and the people here have been so warm and friendly and welcoming that I keep staying, and everyone's like, why are you still here? But I wanted to show you this because it has the museum and then this empty space next to it, which you probably passed on the way in. It's hard to hold the microphone and the picture. Is where Silas Hoskins' bar was. Silas Hoskins, the guy who was the uncle of Richard Wright. And when Elaine was first created by this white guy who got land, like Dr. Ortiz said, just, because he was here. He got land and he wanted to create a dry town. So when he passed these lots in the blocks, he made them all dry. You can't sell alcohol there. But he messed up. And he sold this one, the first block, the third lot, and the fourth lot, all supposedly dry when he gave them to the white people who bought them. This one, he did not give a deed that said that. So that's where Silas Hoskins had his liquor place. You can imagine how that might have pissed off the white guy who started the town. Anyway, he was eventually lynched. He was making lots of money. It's a very sad story. But this is like one of the many stories here of how Black people have been put down in this place, murdered, 1,000 people murdered, and are still here. Okay, you can put that down. Thank you, thank you. Can you pass this out? So I don't know how far into Arkansas any of you have been before. It's not a place that people are like, woo-hoo, Arkansas. Sorry, Arkansas. But it has some really amazing natural features. It is called the natural state. Like Memphis is right here. Okay, Memphis, this is the Mississippi River. You all crossed over it coming from Clarksdale, right? But there's two other big, huge rivers here that everybody who's from here knows this. But if you're not from here, you don't realize. So this river is the Arkansas River, and it goes right through here, and it splits this county, Phillips County, from Desha County, which is very important to the history of here. There's also the White River, which I'm not gonna be able to point out, but it goes right here. So the Arkansas River goes through Little Rock and all the way to Tulsa. I think that's important. So what do you need in order to farm? Land, water, right? Seeds too, and that's a whole nother story. But water and the control of water with the land ownership is part of what has led to the current state of affairs that we're in, which I don't know if you've all heard about the state of our water. We're kind of like Jackson and Flint, thank you, gosh. People have been boiling water, our water system shut down, people here didn't have water. If you get water in some spots, it's brown when it comes out. Like, I hate buying bottled water, I hate it. Walmart is making so much money off of us, and I know they're just getting it from a tap somewhere. Anyway, we have so much fresh water here. There's more fresh water here than anywhere else in the country, and maybe clean in the world here. And it's being controlled by a small number of wealthy white people. And they live in New York and Nashville and travel around the world. And some people are helping fund it that don't realize they're helping fund it with their retirement money. But Phillips County is right here. And if you look at that paper that Faisal just handed out to you, you could see this is the 2020 census data of how many black people are in each county. Now, when I first looked at it, I was like, 7? That can't be right. That must be a percentage. That can't be real. No, 7 black people in that county. 5 black people in that county. That county is where Harrison is. And in 1911, I think it is, Harrison put up a sign at their courthouse, tapped on there, it said, all black people must leave. If you don't leave, you will be killed. So black people left. Meanwhile, here in Phillips County, do you see it's 62% black, the highest of all of the counties in the state. Black people here owned land. 1,000 black people were murdered, massacred, and still there are 10,000 black people here. That is organizing, that is power. And that, I hope that people here realize, like, just being here is an act of, like, F you to those power people. They are doing everything they can to get people to leave. The water situation, the privatization of the water situation. This Helena Harbor, which is these same white people that stole land, and I have documentation of stuff, I won't say names right now, but are controlling the Helena Harbor, that whole, like this whole industrial park where Helm Fertilizer and other companies are coming, and they're building their own private water tower with federal money. Meanwhile, there's leaks, 122 leaks popping up all over the place. The 3 towns that have black mayors now are, if you zoom in on a map of Phillips County, that's where the most of the black people are, is this east side near the river. The schools are being shut down. This school used to help serve Elaine and all south of here. People would come here. And so you haven't gone south of here, but that's where the massacre and the stealing of the land has been happening. Maybe James is going to take you. I just wanted to make sure that you understand the water, and when you came, you probably didn't see food. The only food that is grown is rice, and most of that doesn't stay here. It goes to Riceland farms and is sent out of here. So they're not even growing food. Then they're spraying, constantly spraying all kinds of pesticides, which when you drive into Elaine, what are the first things you see? 3 gas stations. Only one that works, but 3 gas stations, a chemical company, and 2 giant, huge, those are white people competing with each other to sell those giant, huge tractors. They're fighting about that because there's 2 giant farmers or landowner groups, the D-Line Farms, who've brought in people from Mexico, who they threaten, if you won't do what we say, then we're gonna send you back. And they recently, actually, in order to make that point true, brought white people from South Africa to farm. White people from South Africa, not black people from South Africa, to make a statement. And that farmer is from Missouri, and he doesn't actually own all that land. It's owned by another corporation, and he's farming it all and making tons of money, and it's a worldwide corporation. The other farmer is David Brooks Griffin, and his family has taken the land that the several people in this room have farmed on his land. He's taken the land where the sharecroppers and some of the owners of farms, not everyone who was involved in the organizing that led to the massacre were sharecroppers. Many of them, including the ones who stayed in jail and went all the way to the Supreme Court, were landowners. And he is the one who eventually now owns the land where those things were happening. So there's way more to say, but the main point is just that the water control is a huge piece of this. And I wonder now if the river going to Tulsa means anything. All right, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Olson, for the kind words about enacting regular land access for the U.S. And I'll say parenthetically, it is one of the most rapidly banned books now throughout different parts. Unfortunately, the South, it's even banned in the school district where I have a lot of family members, San Antonio Unified in Texas. And so I haven't had a chance to talk to my relatives to tell them why the book is banned. But the importance, I think, is if you look at all the people in this room now, we have different concerns. Some of us are involved in reparations, civil rights, environmental struggles, trans rights, LGBT rights, labor. And to me, that's the meaning, is we're beginning to understand how these struggles fit together. And there's certain unifying themes, one of them being water. If you don't have water, you don't have life. Mm-hmm. And we're beginning to understand in the labor movement, the civil rights movement, and different movements, that environmental justice has to be at the center of everything we do. We're also beginning to understand that when we're talking about reparations, we have to talk about the genocide of Native American peoples in this continent. And when I was growing up in the movement, in the farm worker movement, we were so intensely focused on our struggles, rightly so, I think, but we didn't see beyond the periphery. And like on this trip alone, in the first few days, I've been talking to my students about, the struggles for liberation in Latin America, the historical struggles against slavery, women's rights struggles, what's happening down in Florida. And the meaning, I think, again, is that we're learning to organize more effectively, and we're learning to stop begging people in power for what we should be demanding. What I mean by this is that there's more knowledge now. See, the people in Elaine in 1919, the reason the state attacked them was not because they lacked education. They had enough education for what they were doing. It's because they owned, not only because they owned land, but because they're well organized. They had a union, and not just a labor union, but they were beginning to move towards a cooperative system of agriculture. They were beginning to move towards a cooperative marketing system, a cooperative buying system, and even a cooperative harvesting system. African Americans in the countryside farmed cooperatively. You didn't pull a crop out individually as a cotton farmer. Your neighbors helped you. We've been talking about lodges and masons and groups like that. And in rural Arkansas and Florida and Mississippi, every place I've studied, people farm cooperatively. Okay, that's part of the reason the Elaine Massacre happened, was to destroy Black cooperation. Some call that socialism, right? They don't want us to cooperate. They want us, again, to be isolated individuals with their own isolated identities, looking straight ahead with blinders. But to me, these are some of the things, Dr. Olson, getting back to the question, where now there's a much more sophisticated student movement where students are understanding what we used to call unity of oppression and the unity of struggle. That's the meaning. And we're understanding that institutions like the Supreme Court, feeling sad about what the Supreme Court is doing, is just a waste of time. The Supreme Court in this country was set up to defend the interests of ruling class people in the United States. That's what the Supreme Court was set up to do. It's in the Founding Fathers. Read it. You don't believe me? Read the Federalist Papers. It wasn't set up as a system of checks and balances. And it kind of makes me a little sad when some of my colleagues will say, well, Paul, look at Brown v. Board. Like, yeah, that was a good decision. That's one decision. How about the hundreds of thousands of decisions that are anti-Brown v. Board? You know, we can talk and we should celebrate Thurgood Marshall. Yes. One of the greatest legal minds in the history of this country, or even today. We have 3 courageous Supreme Court justices. But even they have said that if you're looking at the Supreme Court for justice, it's hopeless. Stop begging the people in power to do the right thing. That's what we learned with our faculty union at the University of Florida. Stop begging the president to do the right thing. Stop. Can you imagine going to Ron DeSantis and asking him to do the right thing? So we learned to stop begging, and that's what organizing is. When people get together and say, we're going to change things. And we've shaken things up in Florida, believe me. We had the felony disenfranchisement restoration of rights campaign. We got 1 million signatures just a few years ago. The same time that Trump won the election, we were getting signatures from people to restore the rights of people who have been convicted of felonies, giving them the right to vote. A law that had been passed during Reconstruction to take the right of voting away from Black people. And we got that thing passed. Now, unfortunately, the state has fought that to the nail. The same year we got the $15 an hour minimum wage passed in Florida, right? When the people get together, they can shake things up and change things. That's what I talked about in my forthcoming book, Social Movement History of the United States. Stop looking to the state. Every right that you and I enjoy right now, the fact that all of us from different backgrounds are sitting together in the same room, happened because of a struggle that your elder, your ancestor, my ancestors engaged in. It wasn't because of anything Alexander Hamilton did or James Madison did, because they wanted us divided. Alexander Hamilton despised us. With all love, my dear colleague Lynn, love him, wonderful artist, beautiful soundtrack. Alexander Hamilton hated us, especially if you had any indigenous ancestry. He despised us. But the fact that we're sitting together now is because we had elders and ancestors that fought for our right to be together. So that's what we're recovering at.
But let's be real. If you listen really carefully in that great movie, The Great Debate, Denzel Washington says in one little line, we tried that and it didn't work. How do we combat that? Turn to Jennifer.
Oh my.
Well, give it back to Dr. Ortiz if you want.
Well, no, you did.
Well, I do think, like I said earlier, just the fact that Black people are still here in this county is an act of resistance. And I hope everybody heard that lives here. Right now, we're fighting the school system. People are organizing to try and have a school still be for our kids. Have you all heard the story of what's going on with the schools? Okay, so the governor here is Sarah Huckabee Sanders, the former Trump press lady, you remember her? And she's gonna wanna be the vice president. Either DeSantis or Trump becomes the nominee for the Republicans, she'll be the vice president. Anyway, she passed a law called the Learns Act, which is important to learn about. And it's to privatize the schools. So it gives a voucher for $7,000 so you can go to Christian school, Catholic school, charter school, or public school. But the public schools are having a hard time in places like here getting teachers to stay. And there was a lawsuit trying to make it equal funding across the state so that rural places got equal funding to the wealthy parts of the state. And after the lawsuit was won, then the state punished this area by shutting down the school. So you drove by the school, the Dragons, it said, right across from the beautiful lake. Anyway, right there, that school was shut down because of that. So the lawsuit stuff is not always a victory, but I think people here are always trying to fight just by existing, by trying different things. And right now we are about to have our water meeting. The governor announced that she has a $1.1 billion surplus. Wonder why that is. Maybe because Biden gave a whole bunch of money here, and then instead of spending state money, you just accumulated. So give it to this area that needs new water systems. Because if we're going to fight getting privatized, we need a whole new water system in all along the edge here near the Mississippi River. People here are fighting. I think they're very afraid, rightly so. 1,000 people were murdered, and there's just ongoing pushback. Every time you try something, there's pushback. The shutting down of the school, even when people are fighting to keep the school open where the kids now go, Marvel, there was this threat that, they're going to shut the school down and we won't have a school at all if we don't take the little crumbs that they give us. So there's just always these other messages happening that when I'm organizing in New York, we have to deal with that, but not at the level at all that is here. And I'm sure you're dealing with it in Florida too, but I do think there is an intensity here because it's such a small place. And there's these huge conglomerate farmers that have so much money. And a lot of people, that's their job. Or they're working for the chemical company, or they're working for the farmer, or they're working for one of the people that owns stuff and controls the money. So, but we are fighting, right, Scott?
Yeah.
Yes. Yes, Waylon.
So my question, I don't know who to direct it to, but I think Jennifer and Professor Ortiz. So my question is, with the recent, and again, piggybacking on what you said about the justice system has been it is hopeless. Let me put it in that sense. For the starters, piggybacking on the recent Tulsa massacre court decision, lawsuit being thrown out for the last survivors, which is quite unfortunate. What lessons can we pick from that as a reflection to what happened in Elaine, and what duty do we have as academics and also activists to push forward this agenda as a way of fighting or clashing with the justice system, but at the same time not giving up. So what lesson can we take from the Tulsa court, the lawsuit, and how can we move forward with that? Thank you.
That the court is not the way. I totally think that the court is not the way, that organizing is the way. And I think that's already started to happen here with the money for the museum. I know there's a whole thing about that. And there's going to be pushback big time. I don't think it's like magically going to happen. But I do think building, just the idea that we're going to demand from the governor funds for the water system is, I mean, we could frame it as reparations. I don't think that's a winning argument, but in a way it kind of is. Yeah, and I think we have to keep doing that. We have to build power. And the story is always, oh, white people don't want reparation to happen. I don't think that's true. I think there's more and more white people that think there has to be reparations. There has to be. And I meant to say this earlier, but the Trail of Tears also comes right this way down the river. The Quapaw people were here before and had to go on this river to get to Oklahoma. So.
It's a fabulous question, and your dissertation right now in historical on preservation is the answer. Mm-hmm. You are the answer. We are the answer. The work that we do as historians and storytellers and listeners. I mean, just for a moment, direct your attention to these incredible panels. We love to do this, by the way, in the Oral History program. We have a lot of panels like this, as my students can tell you. We have a People's History of Gainesville. It's 5 canvas kind of fabric panels, and it's a people's history. African Americans, Latinos, underrepresented people, and we loaned it out, and I don't think we'll ever get it back because churches have it, community groups have it, unions have it. This is the work that we have to do. And to me, it's part of the organizing work, is telling the stories of our, basically it's demonstrating to people that our ancestors lived lives of dignity and striving and sacrifice and endurance. I love you say, Jennifer, I mean, if you're living here now, you have been part of the struggle. That museum that y'all are building with the Richard Wright, is it called the Richard Wright Legacy Museum? I can't.
Elaine Museum and Richard Wright Civil Rights Center.
The Elaine Museum and Richard Wright Civil Rights Center is so critical for the long term of this struggle. Because we have to, believe it or not, we have to demonstrate that our people live these lives of dignity and striving and have some successes and produced the greatest, arguably the greatest novelist in American history is Richard Wright. Okay, he's up there in the pantheon, top 5. But to prove that, we need preservation. You need places where people can come to learn the history, to learn the stories. Books are great. Videos are great. You've got to have physical sites. That's why that museum is the key to the future of all of these intersecting struggles, whether it's reparations, human rights, water rights. They will all come together in that museum. Just as I mentioned earlier, Richard Wright started in Mississippi. He's in Elaine in 1916. He's in Jakarta in 1955 in Indonesia. Because he understood the arc of his life was to understand that this struggle is global. I mean, you fight where you're at, but the struggle for human rights is just as intense now in Eastern Europe, in Ukraine, in Latin America, in Canada. The indigenous land struggle is just as intense as the struggles we're waging now. That's where I think the oral history part, the storytelling, telling the stories of our ancestors and elders is so important. Now, not all of them were in the movement, and that's fine. In fact, most of them were not. But even just reminding the mainstream, I'll just call them the mainstream people, whoever they are, reminding them that all of our people here, all of our ancestors, our elders, live lives of dignity is so, so important. And we do our part in oral history, you do your part here, you kind of connect all these things together. But again, I just want to lift up the beautiful museum. that y'all are building, to be able to work with Julia Wright, who is a global poet and human rights activist. And I'll never forget, it's Marshall Dr. Olson, the event we had. Now, Julie and I were on Zoom, so we weren't here, right? But I could sense the energy. And when Julia Wright read her poem, the impact on the children, oh my gosh. When she went in, and her work of preservation, among other things, one more, I gotta tell the story. Can you imagine going in and looking at your father's papers, boxes of them at Yale University, and he's your father, and you know that he was one of the greatest novelists in American history, but you also know that he was dishonored by the American publishing industry. Dishonored. They told him after World War II, he'd written a book called A Man Who Lived Underground. He felt it may be his greatest novel. And his publishers told him, oh, well, actually, they didn't even tell him. Behind his back, they said, well, you know, Mr. Wright, he's at it again. This book is too anti-police. Can you imagine in 1949, a black man writing a book that was critiquing the police? Too anti-police. And the liberal people said that. It wasn't the conservatives. It wasn't Orville Falvis. It was the liberal New York editors. This book is too anti-police. They buried it. And Julia Wright did the work with historical preservation. She said, this is a novel that my father wanted people to read. And she did the work to make that novel accessible. I sat down and one day and read The Man Who Lived Underground, and it just broke my heart. It was the most beautiful novel. I was just astonished. I'm like, this was hidden from the world for about half a century because the publishing industry was afraid it would make white people feel bad about the police. Good night. But preservation, bringing back their father's work, and even telling the story. I've interviewed so many people. My parents were sharecroppers, is how the interview begins. They did the best they could to read that story. Remind people, tell the story. So that's, yeah. Now I'm starting to ramble. I better get the microphone.
Okay, I think we're done, right? I don't know what time it is.
Now we should thank Dr. Ortiz and Jennifer Hadlock for their insights, which we hope by the end of the day will come really alive for you. We're going to eat now. I'm going to suggest we continue the conversation.
Last month, there was an emergency, and the water was shut off in West Helena, and Lakeview has been having off and on water issues. And like I said, the governor announced that she has $1.1 billion, and we need a new water system, but we need money. And so we're talking about how to get that to happen. And that's what the meeting is going to be about.
Okay, thank you. As we go off to eat, I'm going to ask Andrew to come to the mic and say what he said at the mic as our entrance into eating together.
Okay.
I'm a family member of the Shears Ferguson Douglas clans from Ferguson, Arkansas, Cromroy, now they call it. My grandfather's land was taken. We did go to court and win it back. But like I said, everything that's been said here is good and fine. I'm through with talking. It's time to take it back. If something is taken from you, take it back. Put boots in your hand, guns in your pocket, on your side. Take it by any means necessary. That's where I am. That's my thought. That's my thought today.
Thank you. With that, let's start eating and sharing and thinking and eating together.
In Jesus' name, thank God. Amen.